I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. At I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media, imixwhatilike.org for more on this conversation and more. And for this conversation, I'm very excited to be talking with a longtime friend and comrade and colleague, Dr. Iyelli Ichile, who, among many other things, is currently the postdoctoral fellow in African American history at the Reginald F. Museum here in Baltimore. And I wanted to have her come on to talk about some of her work, most notably around the role of African culture and history, spirituality, and politics, and specifically the role of women within African culture, history, and politics, and even more specifically, their role in rebellion. So, Dr. Ichile, welcome to the program. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So as we were talking a little bit, obviously a lot of this is starting around the conversation around Nate Parker's Birth of a Nation. And we started talking a little bit about some of the critique, some of which I've been involved with and others. And you had a particular response based on some of your work that I would like you to first share. And then let's talk about maybe some of what you would have liked to see in that movie, and maybe what you would like to see be discussed as part of the discussion around or the critiques around the film.
Okay, so I guess the broad question is what I thought of the film, or
Well, I mean, we could start there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what did you think of the film? And yeah, what did you think of the film?
uh, I'm ambivalent. I'm ambivalent. So I guess I feel a couple of different ways about the film. I think that as far as films about slavery go, I'm really critical. I tend to be a historian, and it's hard to kind of shut that thing off when you're watching. But from a general like kind of cinematic perspective, and I watch a lot of films. I think about and teach a lot about pop culture and media, because I think that's how I kind of find entry points into like what my students are thinking. But having said that, I think cinematically, I'm always also trying to think there too, and I think it was a decent quality film in terms of like the acting, the directing. It wasn't. They didn't cut a lot of corners in terms of like the budget, but I think there's this constant and recurrent conversation about historical accuracy. I didn't go in with the expectations that there would be a lot of historical accuracy. I think I approached this film the same way I would any slavery film, which is, okay, I'm glad that some ancestors' names are being called. And they will get some things right and they will not get everything right. And that's the best we can kind of hope for. And so, outside of historical accuracy, outside of kind of filmmaking quality, I think the film did some things well, and some other areas are truly problematic. And again, you know, issues with Nate Parker and all that. I don't think my assessment of the film really has anything to do with him as a writer or a director or a person. More importantly, it doesn't really kind of connect with that. So I'm trying to really assess the film.
And clearly, you didn't fall in line with some who have said that we shouldn't even see it just based on his allegations in history and with rape.
No, I'm definitely not aligned with those people. I think there are so many more heinous things that we could boycott. I think we go to the films, to the movies all the time and watch films by rapists, murderers, thieves, all manner of crooks, and give them our money all the time.
Never
We
mind
just
athletes and entertainers.
right.
I mean, R.
How many
Kelly still
rapists
has
have we
is still somehow
called?
running around
Right.
here too. So
So the question is,
and
where do
Woody
we draw
Allen
the
just got a
line?
movie out, right?
Who?
Woody Allen has another movie out, right?
Right.
So right, yeah.
Where do we draw the line is my question, because if we start to go down that path, then we just got to go there and just
Right.
own it, but then we're not watching much of anything. So can we get to this place where we evaluate the product and its merit and separate one individual out of that? Because he's not the only person that was involved in the making of this film.
Right.
Beyond that,
Or it's promotion, distribution,
yeah, there are a
etc.
number of players, and we can have problems with them too. And I'm open to that discussion as well. But I think boycotting this film is not. I don't think it's a useful approach. I don't think it really does anything.
So, but more than anything else, I wanted to talk with you about this film because of your specific work,
Yeah.
and I'm late to it, but I, finally, knowing you for a while, I haven't actually gotten a chance to fully read all of your work, which is, I think, a problem that many of us fall into with our friends, which is not an excuse. But reading your dissertation here, Black Magic Woman Towards a Theory of Africana Women's Resistance. um, uh, I think is not only on its own important and brilliant, but particularly relevant to all the discussion now around this film. That is the role of women in the film, the role of women in reality, in not only Nat Turner's rebellion, but in rebellion in general, and then the way history is told about African women, and specifically to what I most drawn to in your work is not just African women, but African women engaged in rebellion.
Yes.
So could you talk maybe use the film as a segue into that conversation? What the film you said got some right in its presentation, and maybe what we could maybe fill in discussions and work after the film.
Right. So, in my work, and what enabled me to learn more about what African women have done in resistance is looking at this through a spiritual lens. So that's always where I start with things. And so the film made kind of these light attempts at trying to bring uh, kind of an African kind of underlying ethos to like what was going on, even though they kind of diverted into churchy land and the Christian whole tradition. But um, in my work, starting with what we brought here as African people allows us to see the entire community and all of the different roles that are played in that entire community when that community is interested in liberation. And so women just started kind of to appear in the research. Although I will say, as a historian working with kind of like typical historical archival sources, this is the hardest job imaginable. Like for those of us who want to study enslaved African women, our work is tremendously difficult. Most of the time we can go but so far in speculation before we hit these dead ends because men did not write them down. White men did not write them down. Their voices have been silenced simply because of cultural blind spots, because of white supremacy and racism, because of patriarchy. And so finding them is difficult. In the film,
Which also, I'm sorry to interrupt, relates to the problem with telling the story of Nat Turner,
absolutely.
in terms of what we do or don't know as official historical record. But
Absolutely. So, there hasn't been much evidence to support the notion that women picked up, rifles or were marching out to Jerusalem to this armory with the band of rebels. But what I've learned in my research is, and looking at African cultures, African militaristic cultures, African spiritual cultures, I feel completely safe in assuming that women were there and they were involved in significant ways. It's just I didn't go in expecting Nate Parker or any other filmmaker to be able to tell that story because it's hard for me to tell that story. I have to use a lot of other kind of ways of knowing to fill in those gaps. But the women in the film, people kind of have made these arguments that the women in the film are silenced and they're just victims, and they were the only motivation for Nat Turner and the rebels to kind of start this revolt. And I disagree. I tend to disagree with that assessment of the women.
in the
Um,
movie, not in reality, you're
right.
saying that the film doesn't do that.
I don't think that the film. Uh, I didn't have as much of a problem with the way women were depicted in the film as others. I'll say that. Although, of course, he could have gone farther, but I think also the same people who have a problem with the women being raped and the rape being a motivation would probably be the same people who would have a problem if he did try to write those women more fully, because he
Mm.
might not have gotten it right. It's hard to get it right. I think if he had tried to write the voices of those women and he got it wrong, that could have been equally problematic and dangerous for this
Mm.
film. So he did what he could. You know. So Cherry Turner's there. His mother is there. His grandmother is there. Uh, I would even add into that the young girl, the little girl who is liberated from the bed of one of the slaveholders. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if folks
Yep.
really caught that.
Yep. Yep.
Uh,
Right. The pedophilic aspect of the
yes,
rape. Yeah.
we don't acknowledge that, a significant percent of people enslaved were children and what their
Right.
experiences are.
That's right.
So I think that overall, one of the things I enjoyed about the movie is that the characters had dignity. And the women didn't have speaking voices and speaking lines, but I think sometimes we can go too far in terms of prioritizing written words or spoken words and not actions. And then those actions, even when we move toward like freedom fighting, those actions have to look a certain way. So unless she had a gun, she had no power. I don't tend to agree with that. Um, I think one of your other interviews with Dr. Leslie Alexander, she kind of brought up that point, which is women have other ways of fighting, and that's pretty much what my work revolves around. Women did pick up guns, and they did stand shoulder to shoulder with men in those moments of combat, primarily because in wartime, in crisis mode, our African cultures are built in a dynamic way that is meant to adapt, whereby, hey, if we got to mobilize, everyone can be activated as a soldier. So men, women, children, whoever needs to get out there, get out there. So we it's a strengths-based approach to fighting. So I'm assuming there was at least one. I've read accounts of a woman named Charlotte who attempts to do some damage to her mistress. But I think if we only look there and only see that as significant participation, then we've lost a lot of the story.
In fact, if I could, there was
Yeah,
one quote from you that I wanted to highlight because I feel like we might be starting this
sure.
kind of this segue here. But you write a critical reading of both the primary source documentation and the historiography of slave resistance reveals the tendency to dismiss African beliefs and practices as superstition, to demonize them, to diminish their importance, or to ignore them completely. Furthermore, the legal and social measures taken to eliminate African-based spiritual traditions indicate whites' belief in and fear of them. These anxieties are not only linked to sexist, racist views of African people. Most of the negative characteristics ascribed to African spirituality originate in Euro-American folkloric witchcraft. So I mean, just that last line alone, I have about a dozen questions for that we can't get to, I think, in this interview. But I think in the amass of what is to be taken out of that one quote or one statement from you is, I think, what I'm hearing here, even displayed in a film, maybe not by a white filmmaker, but is maybe emblematic of the institution that is hampering him. So because I felt like we got some, as you said, some um, a quick look at something that looked kind of African,
Yeah.
but then we kind of move quickly out of that without any kind of centering or the conversation or what that might allow women in that cultural group to access as part of their form of resistance. So
Right. Right. The
anyway, yeah.
first couple of minutes of the film had me really excited. I was like, oh, his mom brought him to this clearing and there's this ritual happening. And, shout out to Baba Olaitan, Chief Olaitan at Oyetunji Village. So that's a real, the elder he's a real priest, a practitioner. So I thought, somebody in the film did some real research and like try to connect with people who are a part of this story. But I was excited because his mother brought him, and I was like, okay, we might be going somewhere different in this film. And in that moment, I thought, if they could hold on to this thread, then we will see what the women do, and we will actually find out what happened. But yeah, it gets lost. It gets lost. It becomes this Christian liberation theology kind of piece. Although I will say that the even his approach to Christianity and the way he talked about signs and dream interpretation and those visions he was having in the forest where his body was painted with the white clay, and I think there's still an African element there. It's just not contextualized, and for those of us who have been Christian for so long, we don't know how to read that text, that visual text. So there, it falls down. But in my research, that's important. It's important for him to have a film that remains acceptable and comfortable for people to watch. And so he can't go down that road of African spirituality. He can't even go down the road of women's leadership, and the roles in which, women, I mean, because I think that would be scary for a lot of folks. And it's a lot of Black folks too, because we are now Christians. And so we lose that. And I mean, in my research, women are doing all kinds of things, but if we put it in a spiritual context, then it makes sense. If we don't, we either don't see it at all, or it becomes something demonic or negative because that's how it's been written about. But most of what we think about is voodoo and these
Right.
evil pagan satanic practices is just African people who were actually exposed to what Europeans were doing, because they had their own witchcraft practices. And so some of the laws that I've been reading on the book, some of the slave codes and laws that they've passed were about outlawing gatherings like that, about
Right.
keeping Africans from getting together, because they knew the revolutionary potential of those meetings and how those meetings were meant to inspire and bring out that spirit of resistance. But two, because they assumed we were doing what they were doing, which is just wanton evil and harm, without justification. Yeah.
So should just turn towards a conclusion, unfortunately for us in this conversation. I wanted to see if we could bring out some of what we were talking about with another friend of ours offline the other day, and this piece about what Nat Turner's crew's goals were, where they were trying to get to, what they were trying to connect to, that is not discussed in the film,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is important, and how I think that you were relating that to this African experience that is kind of in the background or suppressed in the film, but also in general. Because I do want to lead to a final question for our conversation, which is, what does your work say to women engaged in struggle today?
Mm.
Um, so if we could start with that though, where was Nat and his crew? What were they really trying to get to? It wasn't just about getting to Jerusalem and getting guns. They had a broader goal. If you could talk a little bit about that, and then let's kind of bring that back into this conversation about African spirituality and its relationship to rebellion.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we need to get the vocabulary together. I keep hearing this word revenge, like, oh, he's avenging his wife, and
Right.
I'm like, you didn't see the buildup. There's slavery going on, and everywhere he goes, he gets a broad view of what's happening because he's traveling, in a way that a lot of us aren't traveling. So he sees the suffering in a way that we didn't all get a chance to see. And so there's that. But I think you can't call that revenge. Even I struggle with rebellion.
Mm.
Even I struggle with rebellion and resistance sometimes, because I think if we understand his father and where his father comes from, his father is a Maroon. His father knows what it's like to live, outside of the plantation. His father was free at a point.
So that was my point. I'm sorry to cut you off, but when you talk about
Yeah,
being kind of initially excited at the beginning,
I
I had
was.
a moment when they showed his father, because I'm thinking not only are they showing him with his father in a positive way, which we don't often get to see just generally, black men and their fathers in a
Mm-hmm.
positive light, but that his father was breaking out.
Yes.
So I thought we were going to get to see why, where,
Where's
why
he
he
come?
knew that was possible,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Yeah.
But go ahead, please.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so his father basically teaches him that there's this place you can go. There's something that exists. We don't just have to go up north. We don't have to go to Canada. There's a place that
Right.
we have created, a space that we defend that belongs to us where you can be free. And it's right down the road. And he's trying to get there. And so he has a goal. He has a
And that's
vision and a plan.
the dismal swamp.
The
Yeah.
swamp, right? And so there's all kinds of like archaeological digs that have been happening where they're finding evidence of these communities of Africans who lived in this swamp as free people, and that's where the rebels were headed, and that's where the soldiers were headed. I think we should really elevate this to the level of discussing it as a war.
Mm.
I thought he shot the battle scenes pretty well and depicted it as a battle scene, and I think that is important because I
Which
think
again, for the record, we're not historical.
right, we're
That
not
didn't
being
happen, but to your
right,
point,
but
yeah.
right. So we're talking about we're not talking about historiographically
Mm.
whether this was accurate. We're talking about representationally.
Gotcha.
How does this shift and elevate the conversation to the where it should be? And I think that the film gets a lot wrong, but I like the fact that he was seen as kind of like a commander, like
Right.
a lieutenant in a war. Um, it
And
didn't
they
go down
called
like
him
that,
general.
but yes, because I think that once we start talking about that, then we say, okay, a war has an objective. There is a goal. There's an overarching significance to this. And so when there is attrition, when people die in the war, They understand that they have died for a cause that is greater than just themselves.
Right.
Just, somebody hurt my boo. Something broader and
Right.
more deeply significant. So I think that mattered.
So
Mhm.
so if we can connect that to this attempt to move in terms of the real history, to move to this dismal swamp maroon community, to escape,
Yeah.
to engage his part of this war. And I like how you frame that. Um, uh, what then does that say, or how does your work focused on African spirituality and women engaged in this war fit into that element of the
Hmm.
story that's missing from the film? And then, but then also, what does that say, or what would you like to say, or what should women today, often in the leadership of many of these formations involved in our version of the war, um, what does it say to them, or what should it say to them, or what would you like to say to them about that?
So the war, I think, was an effort for them to find their way to this swamp community and seek something called sovereignty. I think that's what they wanted. I think that Africans were never just okay, like I'm gonna get free and a couple of us, and it's okay. If you even look at Prosser's Gabriel in Richmond area, like they wanted to get free space and territory that belongs to them where they can be how they want to be. And I wondered, because it was so Christian, how a super Christian Nat Turner was going to end up in this maroon community. So that's why I thought that was
Mm.
problematic. How much this was driven by this like transcendent Christianity that's just so awesome that it just changes everyone's mind about wanting to be free. But
And again, if to the extent that historical record is important, we only
yeah,
think we know what we know about Nat's Christianity from Gray, right? I mean, isn't that where it starts? I mean, we don't have, to my knowledge, forgive me, I may not be up on the literature enough, but to my knowledge, we don't have sort of independent or alternative or even African sources that would make the claim to the extent of his belief in Christianity or how he used it. Unless maybe I'm missing something
oh,
there too.
I mean, I'm in no way a Nat Turner rebellion expert.
Right, right,
Know this in and out. I don't, but I have not come across sources that, especially not Black community sources, family voices, that really focus on him being a preacher, and that was the significance of Nat Turner. That
by the
really
way,
just
we're addressing that.
brings.
Our collective is addressing that in terms of the Turner family descended voices. So people should stay tuned for more on that. That is coming, by the way. But I'm sorry. Please again continue.
But my understanding of this Maroon Society, this dismal swamp community of runaway Africans, is that they had a very African way of organizing themselves. This enabled us to go back to the ways, the ways of his childhood, the place where he started. In this community, they have a council of elders. They have a democratic kind of leadership style. They have a queen at some point, who can speak to birds and give spiritual baths and all these things. So, even in the telling that comes from this guy named Hugo Prosper Leeming, this guy who writes at that time about the Dismal Swamp community, or what he understands of the Dismal Swamp community. Of course, he's a white outsider, but for him to even write that down means that something interesting was happening in that community, and it
Right.
didn't look European, it didn't look American colonial, it didn't look, like anything he was aware of. But he could not, again, deny that there was some woman in there that was important to the whole thing going. And Nat was heading toward her. Like, he was heading toward that space where that kind of leadership structure is in place. And I think for women today, and this is kind of, if I tell myself that somehow my work as a historian has some relevance to now, I hope it does, then we have a blueprint. Then the ancestral mothers have left us a way to understand that leadership and uh, being free is a is enacted through our relationships with each other,
Hmm.
and enacted through uh, there must be other ways of knowing, that are outside of the ways that we have been given and taught. There must be a prioritization, like giving priority importance to how we care for each other. Because if we fight, 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 and then at the other side of it, we're all crumbled and we're not able to enjoy this freedom, what have we accomplished? I think that um, plugging up to our sources of power are critical. The women in this film, I think, are not on the sidelines if we move and shift and expand our understanding of power. I think power is not just at the end of a gun. Power is not just who talks the most and who gets to try to define everything. I think that we need to talk more about family dynamics. I think we need to talk more about spiritual power. I think we need to talk more about other types of authority that people can have. I mean, the fact that he went to his mother and told her she doesn't have to work today, and she said, "I'm proud of you." Like, that's not just a cheering from the sideline. That he needed that. He needed that. He needed his permission from his wife. Cherry Turner was a tactician, and people don't really think of her that way. I mean, because she did, that wasn't in the film, but that wasn't documented. Nobody wrote down that Cherry Turner was the one who had all the maps in her head and taught the rebels about the terrain and where they need to go. Nobody wrote that down because those were conversations. Those were internal dialogues that were happening in intimate spaces between people. And I think if we look there and see that as power, and we see that as authority, and we see that as like the driving force, then we've got a whole different story on our hands. And we have powerful women, and we have examples for how we can approach our liberation and fill in some of these blind spots that leave us war-torn and weary and crumbly, or sometimes without lacking direction. When we're struggling out here. So, yeah, I hope that answered the question.
I think so. At least it gives us a starting point. And of course, this won't be our last conversation. It will continue between us and the rest of our colleagues and crew at imixwhatilike.org. But Dr. Iyelli Ichile, thank you again for joining us. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you and our audience, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace.
Peace.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.